times. And I was wondering, what am I doing here? I'm Jewish. So I've noticed a lot of places people try, even religious people, when they talk about spirituality, it doesn't really come from religions a lot of times.
It's very interesting, the instinct you're talking about, and a lot more complicated than we have time for tonight. But, yes, in short, when people are looking for additional guidance and strength, they'll often reach for almost any source, anything that will give them that feeling that they are protected, encouraged, guided, more than they could on their own. And yeah, oddly, you'll have, somebody that isn't religious doing something that is religious, somebody that's from one faith interacting with the rituals or the traditions of a different faith. It's part of I believe, the innate human nature of reaching out for the divine, but it's also part of our innate, don't take this the wrong way, because this is for all of us, incompetence of doing that on our own. Meaning left to our own devices, purely coming up with it on our own, we're not great at it, which is, of course, how idolatry got going and so many other problems spiritually over the last 10,000 years. But yeah, it's definitely a drive towards spirituality, towards a reaching out for the divine. We're just not good at it without guidance, which is, of course, why we are here for Mishnah tonight, why we have our ritual of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and everything else from the Yamim Noraim is there to guide us, to feed that instinct of reaching for the divine, but to do it in a way that is a part of this complete breakfast, as the old commercials used to say when I was growing up. So yeah, I think that that kind of story that you shared is very normal globally. All right, well, that gives us a little bit of a buffer as well for the start. One of the jokes I always say is that it's easy to talk about spirituality. It is harder to recognize it when you are in some of the messier topics in the Mishnah. A lot of people think spirituality just means chanting quietly to yourself on a mountaintop, but that's not really Jewish spirituality all that much. More on that another time, I'm sure. So as we pick up here in chapter 6 in our last Mishnah class of 5783, we are going to get a rapid-fire succession of topics that follow the same pattern that we had in Mishnah 1. As Dr. Kolb points out in his introduction, it is the classic, it's possible for there to be X without Y, but not possible for Y without X. Sort of like the old adage, all dogs are mammals, but not all mammals are dogs. That there is a Venn diagram that we could draw for those of you that love that type of logical reference, where you have the circle, and within that circle, there is a smaller circle fully contained. Everything in the smaller circle is a subset of the big circle, but not everything in the big circle is in the small circle. Otherwise, they would be two equal circles that perfectly overlapped. And with that theme, we're going to continue for the next 9 Mishnayot of these types of things. So that is our thematic link. They are from a wide range of topics. So we'll be playing sort of hopscotch through Jewish topics. It may not feel spiritual, and that's definitely a challenge, I know, for many of us, to recognize that the specificity with which Mishnah guides us in our understanding of the world around us, in our own behaviors, in the need for the guidance in Jewish law and practice, doesn't always resonate with the average person who's looking for that mountaintop chanting moment. But this is a whole lot more effective in actually achieving the goals of spirituality, which is not to feel spiritual. One of the great mistakes in the modern world, where people think the goal of spirituality is to feel spiritual. No, spirituality is there to guide yourself in how you live, not just to give you that cool, tingling experience, but to give a lasting impact in all of your experiences. But enough of that. I'll save the sermons for high holidays. Chapter 6, Mishnah number 2. Let's dive in and get my mouse moving so it doesn't roll away. Similarly, and again, the similar here is the X and Y category, subcategory. Any hole in an earthen vessel that lets in a liquid will let it out, but there may be one that will let liquid out and will not let it in. All right, as Dr. Cole points out in his commentary, this is talking about the structure of a like an amphora or another jar. And when a jar is broken, it is no longer susceptible to ritual purity because it is no longer considered usable. But one way to define brokenness, apart from the obvious shattered into 1,000 pieces, is when it's got a hole that's too big in it. And what would a hole that's too big in it be? Well, a hole that's so big that stuff goes in as well as stuff comes out. Now, what would it look like physically to have a hole that lets liquid out but doesn't let liquid in? Well, just imagine a very, very fine crack, like a needle prick somewhere through the crevices of the clay wall, that if you fill it up with water, the water will come dripping out. But if you were to take it empty and submerge it in water, the water would not push its way in. That's the second type here. Now, if the hole is big enough that it lets water in, then obviously it's going to let water out. But it is possible to have a hole that is small, so small it doesn't let water in, but it will let water out. And that does have a practical effect. If the container will still keep the outside water out, even if it's leaking a little bit, dripping a little bit, then it is still considered to be a usable vessel, and it is still thus susceptible to issues of ritual purity. So it's not broken just because it's leaking a little. It's only broken when it leaks so much that the water goes both directions. So that is the basic point that is being made in this Mishnah. Make sense? Again, we're not going to go into all the details. As you can see, the reference from Kelim, there's much more to be said about the status of vessels in that Masechet of Mishnah. Any limb that grows a nail also has a bone in it, but there may be one that has a bone in it, but does not grow a nail. So again, talking about a purity issue, the issue here is that if you have a piece of a human body that has a bone in it, then that piece, even if it is smaller than the standard measure of an olive size, will still render other things ritually impure in the normal way that a human corpse will render it impure. On the other hand, if you have a piece of human body that is that doesn't have a bone in it, but it's just a chunk of flesh, essentially, then it does not have the same status. It has to be of the minimum measure before it's considered to be significant enough to generate ritual impurity. So the bone, if you will, turns up the ritual impurity effect. How do we know whether something has a bone in it or not? Well, if it's got a nail, meaning like fingernails, then we know it has a bone in it. Because there's no part of a human body that has fingernails that doesn't also have a bone in it. On the contrary, though, if it doesn't have a fingernail, that doesn't mean we can automatically assume it doesn't have a bone. We know that some of the appendages do, even if they don't have a nail on that particular bit of the limb. So that's the distinction that's being made here. And as it's pointed out in Oholot, there's a whole nother Masechet that deals with this issue of the ritual impurity, in particular, that comes from the bodies of a human being. Questions or comments on that? Again, we're not going to go into the entire Masechet worth of information, but if there's anything I can clear up easily, I'll be happy to do so. All right, moving on to 6.3. Whatever is susceptible to midras uncleanness is also susceptible to corpse uncleanness. All right. midras uncleanness we've mentioned a few times, but it's not one of our more common discussion points. Midras uncleanness is something that is rendered unclean by having a person who is ritually impure in that type sit upon it, or lay down on it, or leaning upon it, or resting upon it, I guess might be the best idea, the best summary. Now, in order for something to actually be susceptible to that type of uncleanness, it has to actually have been made for that purpose. Chairs, beds, sofas, that kind of thing, a bench. But just sitting down on a barrel or just sitting down on a rock, even more so, does not make it susceptible to that midras uncleanness. It is the purpose of the chair, of the surface that matters, not how it's currently being used. So there are things that are susceptible to midras uncleanness, but they can also be susceptible to corpse uncleanness. Now, that's usually a much wider category of things which can be susceptible to corpse uncleanness. Just about any object is susceptible to that sort of thing. However, when we look in the mirror, but there are things that are susceptible to corpse uncleanness, but not to midras uncleanness. And that, again, is very obvious, as he points out, things like a shirt or a bowl or whatever you like. Those things would be susceptible to the impurity of being in the proximity to a corpse, but they would not be susceptible to midras uncleanness. If I sit on my shirt, it does not magically turn into a chair, and it does not magically succumb to the impurity of the midras status. But if it's in the same vicinity as the human remains, then it does. That one, I think, is fairly straightforward. Some of these are easier to understand than others, but as always, feel free to ask questions if you have them. Let me just double check in there. Okay. Switching topics from purity cases in Mishnah number 4. Anyone who is fit to try capital cases, meaning where the punishment is death, is also fit to try monetary cases. But there are those who are fit to try monetary suits and are unfit to try capital cases. So there are many different rules, as we covered when we went through Sanhedrin, of who is fit to try which types of cases. In particular, the Talmud calls out in this distinction point the issue of somebody that is a convert or somebody that is a mamzer that is not permitted to serve on a capital case jury. However, they are still fine with proper training, of course, to sit and serve with a monetary case. Yes, there are people who, anybody who will fit for a capital case could also handle a monetary one, but it doesn't work the other direction. There are those that could do a monetary case, but would not be acceptable as part of the tribunal, the Beit Din, for a capital case. Now, in case you are wondering why would a convert and a mamzer not be allowed to sit on a capital case, well, it has to do with a topic that I have discussed quite a bit in recent months, years, lose track sometimes, that the pursuit of justice is not only the pursuit of the right verdict in a particular case, but also the pursuit of the right perception of the right verdict in any particular case, meaning that the community, the society, has to be willing to accept the verdict in order for justice to be seen to be done. And while we can wax poetic about the beauty of pure justice, where society is blind to those who are administering justice, like the Kohanim under their talits who are giving their blessing, it is not the individual that matters, but the verdict that flows forth. We know that that's simply not the way many people work. That oftentimes we need extra effort to make sure that the community will recognize that the verdict that has been handed down is a correct verdict. Now, in monetary suits, we're not going to go to such great lengths, but when it comes when it comes to a case where a person will be put to death based upon the verdict that is reached, then there is an extra requirement that we should placate the needs of the community, if you will, even when these are their baser needs, to make sure that the verdict will be accepted as being valid. If the community believes that somebody with a less enmeshed lineage, less tied up with the entire community, is rendering a verdict that will lead to the execution of one of their members, then the community might be suspicious of the accuracy of that verdict. The person doesn't have the same stake in the community and such. Now, is that true? Of course not. Somebody who converts and somebody who is a mamzer absolutely should be a priori from the outset assumed to have an equal stake and an equal conviction in the good of the community. However, we know that humans are sometimes annoying and don't look at each other with that same degree of acceptance and that same degree of willingness to hear the validity of a person if they do not already accept that person well within their community. Now, again, we can try to be poetic and pure and say, who cares what they think? But with the erosion of the acceptance of the system of justice, society will collapse. So the Mishnah and rabbinic law does sometimes make exceptions in order to protect the overall community from the misperceptions of some of its less educated, less tolerant, less noble members. And again, we can decry that, and we can certainly try to move the needle away from that. But nonetheless, it is still something that must be taken into consideration when trying to actually pursue true justice in a community, rather than just trying to solve the equation with regards to a particular case. The same issue comes up with the Torah's prohibitions on certain types of Kohanim not being allowed to officiate at the altar. While their status as a Kohen remains unblemished, because of the blemishes that they have, the community may not be willing to accept their service as indeed avodah, and as such, the Torah says they have to sit that part out. Aaron, I think I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, briefly about the death penalty stuff, though. At the time this Mishnah was written, it would have been after Akiba, who wanted to abolish the death penalty altogether. Does this have anything to do with that at this point in time it was taken more seriously, and that they really are trying to avoid it and only have it imposed when really necessary, or no?
I mean, so yes, it's very good that you bring up the rabbinic ambivalence towards the death penalty. That Judaism is very reluctant as a whole to overuse this particular punishment. The very steep evidentiary and procedural barriers make it unlikely that capital cases will be taken to their full conclusion, meaning an execution. However, I believe this particular Mishnah is not speaking to that issue, but is talking to the general issue of how do we make sure that society is at least willing to go along with a capital case when we are forced to actually have a capital case. Because remember, a society not only needs to accept the justice of a capital case when the criminal is executed, the society also has to accept the justice of a capital case when the presumed criminal is exonerated. And to, quote, let someone off the hook, which is how some people will certainly feel if they are baying for blood of the accused, you need to make sure that your baked in is beyond reproach, or else the people will either no longer trust it, or even worse, will take the punishment into their own hands with extrajudicial killings, or as we call them in Judaism, murder. So I think it's working both ways to try and validate both the guilty verdicts as well as the not guilty verdicts that might come down. But you're right, that Judaism as a whole, Rabbi Akiva very famously as sort of a exemplary case, are opposed to having overuse of capital punishment. And then we get an additional parallel. Anyone who is eligible to act as a judge is eligible to serve as a witness. But there may be one who is eligible to act as a witness and not a judge. Now, Dr. Culp brings the sort of straightforward example of how you could work this out, that somebody that was unlearned would still be eligible to act as a witness, but they would certainly not be eligible to act as a judge. However, the Talmud and other commentaries go a little bit deeper. They actually argue not that one who is eligible to act as a judge, but eligible to become a judge, or eligible not through any lacking of knowledge, but physically disqualified from serving as a judge, at least in certain places. And they bring up the issue of tzara'at, that for a judge to be able to identify the illness tzara'at, often erroneously called leprosy, they have to be able to see clearly. And if somebody is blind in one eye or has other very high difficulty with vision, then they cannot serve as a judge despite their learning to be able to identify certain symptoms, the way the skin actually appears, which is essential in that case. However, such a person would still be perfectly fit to give testimony as a witness, even if they were physically disqualified from serving as a judge in such cases. 6.5. Whatever is subject to tithes is subject to food uncleanness. But there are foods that are subject to food uncleanness, but are not subject to tithes. All right, this one is actually simpler than it might sound at first. Food uncleanness, of course, is the fact that certain foods, when we have gathered them in, and then when they get moist, are then susceptible to ritual impurity issues. Tithing, of course, is something that has been grown, that needs to then be, a tenth of it needs to be separated before the remainder of it can be eaten, and the tenth given according to whichever year it happens to be for the directive of the tithe. Now, for things that are being tithed, they have to literally grow from the ground. That is to say, they have to be vegetable based, I guess you could say. And as such, things that are like eggs or meat or fish, which don't grow from the ground, are not subject to being tithed, but they are subject to food impurity. But obviously, there are plenty of things that are subject to food impurity, like the aforementioned food, but are not subject to tithing. Again, that one I think is pretty straightforward when you look at the broad categories of food. Similar to that, Mishnah 6, whatever is subject to peah is also subject to tithes. But there is produce which is subject to tithes and is not subject to peah. All right, so now we're going to get a little bit more refined, which is to say, peah is the obligation to leave the corners of one's field. This is another part of the poverty legislation, where the poor are allowed to come and take from the corners. This is in addition, of course, to the gleaning in the middle of the fields after the owner has done his first pass. So whatever is eligible or required to give peah is always going to also need tithes. So this is your standard things like wheat and barley and spelt and all of your wonderful grains that are waving in the field. If it has to be done, if you have to give peah from it, then yes, you will obviously then have to give tithes. But there are types of produce which you have to give tithes from, but you do not have to leave peah for. That peah is not a part of it. And this has to do with the harvest style. If you are harvesting a particular crop all at once, meaning that that is the normal way to harvest it because it all ripens at once, then that is something that is subject to both peah and tithes. On the other hand, if it is a crop that ripens irregularly, meaning that some things ripen early, some things ripen late, and you are sort of collecting and gathering them or picking, in the case of fruit, throughout a broad season, then we are obligated to give tithes from that, but we are not obligated to give peah. The other example is, in addition to fruit from the tree, fruit that grows at multiple times from the tree, is vegetables that can also grow throughout a long growing season. Your carrots don't all get pulled up at the same time. Your tomatoes don't all get pulled at the same time. That sort of thing. Remembering, of course, that vegetables and fruit are much more likely to rot once picked. It's one of the reasons why it's good that they ripen across this broader timeline, unlike grains, which once picked can be processed quite easily into a longer lasting form, what we usually call flour, but there are other ways to preserve grain as well. Questions, comments? All right. Whatever beast, because we're going to be talking about animals here, is subject to the laws of the first of the fleece, is also subject to that of the priestly gifts. The priestly gifts here are the portions, like the cheeks and other portions of the animal that are reserved for the Kohanim, that when an animal is slaughtered, they get those portions. The first of the fleece, of course, is the taking from the shearing of the wool. So there are some animals where we have to do the fleece. There are any animal where we have to do the fleece. We also have to do the priestly gifts, the other meat portions. But there are animals where we do have to give the meat portions, but we do not have to give the first of the fleece. And this one again goes back into the easy category, because there are plenty of animals like cows that we don't fleece. We don't shear a cow. We don't get wool from a cow. And if you're not clear on that, go visit a farm sometime. But of course, for the cow, we still have to give the matanot, the gifts of the portions of the animal that are reserved for the Kohanim. So again, that Venn diagram, those circles are pretty clear. There's only some animals that need shearing, but there are lots of animals that we can eat within the kosher circle that we still have to give the portions to the priest. Mishnah number 8. Whatever is subject to the law of removal is also subject to the sabbatical year. But there is a kind of produce that is subject to the sabbatical year and is not subject to the law of removal. All right. Again, a little bit more complicated because we're not in the laws of Shemitah right now. But depending upon how many of my videos you've watched, you may have come across this at least sometime. If not, here's your introduction. So when we are in the sabbatical year, when we are in the issue of Shemitah, there is a general permission to eat things that grow wild from the field. We're not allowed to plant. We're not allowed to reap it as a harvest, but we can go out and take what we need for today and use it. Remembering, of course, that anything growing during the sabbatical year is available to anyone. That is ownerless, and you are just one person who happens to be coming along and eating it. However, you do have a small amount of time while something is growing and during its harvest time where you can take more than you need for today, but you can only keep that up till the point where it is still available in the field such that even animals could be able to eat it. Once you've passed the point where it's no longer wildly available, then even if you've got it stored in your house, it has to be destroyed. You're not allowed to essentially hoard this produce during the sabbatical year. As long as it's available for everyone, then you're allowed to keep it. Once it's not available to everyone, then it is not available to be kept. Now, this is generally here as we're talking about things that are subject to the sabbatical year, meaning that you still, even if you brought it in, you wouldn't be allowed to do business with it. You can't go and buy and sell it and all of those sorts of things. You're just gathering it. And as Dr. Kolb reiterates from my own explanation, it has to remain ownerless. However, if there is produce that grows in the field all year round, there are certain perennial type of plants that are always growing, then it is still subject to the sabbatical year, meaning that we still can't gather it, buy it, sell it, all those kinds of things in a way that would violate the laws of Shemitah. But we also don't have to worry that it will no longer be available in the wild, and thus any that we might have stored in our house will never have to be destroyed, because there's always some of it growing out there, and that means it is still freely available to all. Hope that makes enough sense to get through for tonight. The laws of sabbatical year are deep and complex, but maybe we'll do that some other time in the future, because it's something that I find especially powerful because of the underlying implications of shared universal ownership or access to the land. It is a fascinating topic, but one that is not of immediate use to most of us that are not farmers, although there are some implications for produce in the modern world. But like I said, that's a whole nother masechet for a reason. Mishnah 9 comes back to be a little bit more practical. What has scales has fins, but there are fish that have fins and no scales. All right, as everybody who learns about kashrut learns very, very quickly, in order for an animal to be kosher, if it's swimming in the ocean, it has to have fins and it has to have scales. What the rabbis are making here is an observation that if it has scales, problem solved, because there's no species that is kosher that has scales that lacks fins. On the other hand, there are fish out there that have fins, but they do not have scales. The most famous example here in the American South is the catfish, which has fins. It looks very fishy, but it does not have true scales, and as such, catfish is not kosher. So if it's got scales, we know it has fins. If it doesn't have fins, then if it has fins, we don't know anything yet about its scales. It could have scales, it might not. This is one reason why if you are in a pinch and you're trying to buy a piece of fish, if the piece of fish that you're looking at has part of the skin and you can see the scales on it, then you can be rest assured that it comes from a kosher species. On the other hand, if it has a fin attached to it but no skin, well, you can't make a determination yet from that. And again, this is in more detail in Hulin. And then to continue our kashrut topic, whatever has horns has split hooves. But there are animals that have split hooves and no horns. Now here we are talking about what you might call a true horn. So we're not talking about a rhinoceros, for example, or a narwhal kind of thing. We're talking about your nice standard sort of four-legged, what's the right word for it? Four-legged mammal-ish kind of animal. So if it's got real horns, then we can rest assured that it will have proper kosher hooves. On the other hand, just because it has hooves doesn't mean that it will have horns. And that means that there are some animals with horns that we can easily tell will definitely be kosher. And there are some animals with split hooves that we cannot tell they're kosher just by the split hoof. We have to look for other signs to reaffirm that. The pig is the most famous of that has split trotters, but is not kosher. Of course, there are other animals, certain types of deer that are kosher, but also don't have horns. So it's a little bit more complicated going from one direction to the other. And of course, just because something has horns and split hooves, we would, of course, always want to double check that it also chews its cud, excuse me. But that, again, is more in depth in our discussion of kashrut. All right. And one more very intimate, daily, accessible, usable teaching. Whatever requires a blessing after it requires one before it. But there are things that require a blessing before them and not after them. So there are many different brachot that we make for different things during the day, whether it be for things we are about to eat, whether it be for experiences that we are enjoying, or whether it be for the performance of mitzvot. And the rule is that if we have a blessing that comes after it, then you can rest assured there will indeed be a blessing before it. However, just because something has a blessing before it does not mean that there will be a blessing after, and indeed there are many that have blessings before which do not have any blessing after. For example, many of the blessings that we have for experiences in the world around us. On the other hand, when we go to eat, the blessing after is the ikar, the essence of the deed, and the blessing before it, you know that there needs to be one because there was a blessing after. Likewise, for the performance of different mitzvot, we will do a blessing before it, but we don't do blessings after. I don't need to say a blessing after I've put on the talit. I don't say a blessing after I've lit the candles. About the candles, obviously, there are other blessings that we do during those time periods, but they are not related to the performance of the mitzvah. Questions or comments? Okay. Before we continue with Mishnah number 11 and through to the conclusion of the this chapter, I just want to give a reminder to anyone that is only catching up with us now that this section of Niddah deals with the human body. We've been trying to discuss it in a frank and straightforward way while still being sensitive. But please be aware that we will be talking about the development in particular of the human body. And yes, that does mean talking about young people as they transition through the path of puberty. With that warning in place, let's go on. If a girl has grown 2 pubic hairs, she may perform either chalitza or contract levirate marriage, and she is obligated in all the commandments of the Torah. So too, if a boy has grown 2 pubic hairs, he is obligated in all of the commandments in the Torah. All right, so this is the lower sign that we had talked about in previous sections. Excuse me. And as always, the rabbis use as the benchmark the development of 2 of the hairs in that section, that portion of the body, as being a sign that indeed puberty is well underway. And for both boys and girls, that means that they are now obligated in the commandments of the Torah. We get the example for a girl of chalitza and levirate marriage, as this is something that we need to know sort of immediately, because it's an obligation that can fall upon her shoulders with the death of her brother-in-law. So that is something that we need to have immediate cognizance of her obligation. Now, you may notice that this is the technical benchmark of being a bat or bar mitzvah. To be bound by the commandments means to have entered this stage of physical development. To enter this stage of physical development means you bound by the commandments. Now, we do not check in the modern world for these physical signs. We have set as our benchmark, like we discussed earlier, 12 and 13 for girls and boys, as being the public assumption of the beginning of puberty. While technically it could happen earlier. Whoop, I just lost my connection. Maybe, hold on. Well, no, it isn't doing its usual bumping me out of Zoom. All right, whatever the flicker is doing, I'll just carry on with it. And if it doesn't work, I'll just do more when I'm doing next week's. All right, yeah, I think it's still working. Maybe. Let's find out. As I said, the benchmark in the modern world, and I say modern, the benchmark for a very long time, thousands of years plus, is to go by the base number of years rather than the actual sign of the beginning of puberty. For those of you that are interested, at Temple Israel, even though we follow the rules, of course, when it comes time to having a ceremony to celebrate the entry of a young person into the ranks of adulthood, we do have that celebration at 13 for both our boys and our girls. Our bar and bat mitzvah celebrations are the same in order to ensure that both boys and girls are receiving an equal measure of instruction, of education. Unfortunately, many people, once they have had the ceremony of becoming a bar or bar mitzvah, don't stick around for as much education, and that is a real shame. And as such, we do want to make sure that they complete as much as we can require them to do before that may happen. Obviously, we encourage and try to facilitate ongoing education, but we have to do the best we can in the situation in which we find ourselves. Carrying on with our question of what other halakha comes into effect at this time. He is fit, meaning the boy who has had the two hairs, to become a wayward and rebellious son. Fit here, by the way, does not mean that you should. Fit simply means that the halakha, ben sorer moreh, is now applicable to the young lad from the time he has grown two hairs until the time when his beard forms a circle. What does that mean? This refers to the lower and not to the upper one, but the sages spoke using a euphemism, a lashon naki, a clean language. All right, so first of all, let's recognize that the halakha of the wayward and rebellious son is limited to only this narrow period of time when he is technically an adult and bound by the commandments, because punishing him before that wouldn't make sense since he is not liable for the commandments, but it is still during that period when he is under his parents' jurisdiction. So thus, his waywardness and rebelliousness from them is a unique violation. Once he has developed more fully, then he is no longer in that window. Now, the rabbis use the euphemism of his beard forming a circle, basically to mean once the hair in the lower section has filled in more fully. Now, it's ironic, yes, that they use a euphemism, and then the next sentence explains the euphemism. Because what's the point of a euphemism if I'm going to explain it immediately? Why not just say, from the time he has grown two hairs until the pubic hair has filled in more fully? Well, for one, that would not teach us the advantage of speaking with euphemisms, meaning that the rabbis did believe that while we speak about these topics in a way that is frank and honest, that we should still not be gratuitous, that we should still not accustom ourselves to using language which is coarse. By using the euphemism and then explaining it, it is reinforcing that idea. And it is also trying to steer us away from casually using coarse language to talk about the human body, or even to talk about the human body in a way that could become coarse with familiarity. However, having used the euphemism, the Mishnah does also recognize that while that is a useful principle to teach, we do need to make sure that everybody understands that we're not talking about this time period lasting from the first sign of puberty until the time when a beard is fully formed on a young man's face, because that would keep the window open much wider than is meant. And so they do need to unpack the euphemism in order to make sure that the halakha is not misunderstood. A girl has grown 2 hairs, may no longer refuse the marriage. Rabbi Yehuda says she may refuse until the black hairs predominate, until it has become filled in. Now, here we're talking about the case of a minor that was betrothed by her brother or mother because the father is no longer alive, and that, of course, she has a right to refuse up until the point that she becomes of majority, her full maturity. Now, this refusal is a special kind of annulment, and as such, there is a window in which the annulment can take place, just like in modern American law. An annulment needs a special set of circumstances, or else it has to be a divorce. So the window here is that she can refuse that wedding, that marriage, with it being rendered just an annulment, which is a different status than divorce, only up until the point when she is displaying the beginning of puberty. From that point on, then it would need to be a full divorce to separate. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says that she has longer to refuse until there is even more hair showing in that region. And let's go ahead and do one more hair conversation. The 2 hairs spoken of in regard to the red heifer and in regard to leprosy, that's sara'at, as well as those spoken of anywhere else, like where we are discussing, must be long enough for their tips to be bent to their roots, the words of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Eliezer says long enough to be grasped by a fingernail. Rabbi Akiva says long enough to be taken off with scissors. All right, so when we say hair, what do we mean hair? Do we mean a dark speck of the first bit of hair coming out of a follicle? Or do we mean something that is, a yard long? Well, each of the rabbis provide a different measurement for how long the hair has to be before it counts as hair, and thus how long 2 of them would need to be. Rabbi Ishmael's is the longest, meaning that it is long enough that you can actually bend the hair back over and touch itself to the root, which will depend, of course, a bit on the flexibility of the hair, but that is, relatively long. Rabbi Eliezer says long enough to be grasped by a fingernail, which is not long, just, long enough that you can get 2 fingernails on each side of it and give a little tug. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, says that it can be short, so short that all you need to be able to do is get the 2 sides of a scissor against it and give a slice, and that really can be, not much more than just barely poking out of the skin. And interestingly enough, all 3 of these actually do become a measure at different times, meaning that in particular for humans, not for the red heifer so much, whenever we need to be strict, we will use the strictest definition. If it means to be strict to have the person be older, then we go by Rabbi Ishmael. If it means to be strict to have the person younger, then we have Rabbi Akiva. So there are ways that all 3 of these can work at different times, depending upon the situation. And, let's see, where we got time. Yeah, we can we get through this? This is, what happened? I see what happened. I thought that this looked much, much longer, but what happened here is the coding did not work because it's all bold when it should not be, and that was really throwing me off because I did not remember this Mishnah being that long. All right, so I'll go ahead and read it and point out where Dr. Kolb's commentary kicks in. A woman who found a bloodstain is in a spoiled condition and must take into consideration the possibility that it was due to ziva, the words of Rabbi Meir. Spoiled is not a great translation. I'm sorry, Dr. Culp, because there's just too much baggage in the English of the 21st century. It basically means you're in a quandary. You are in a state of uncertainty, meaning that you are you don't know what to do. So what do we say? Rabbi Meir, well, what does Rabbi Meir say? Rabbi Meir says, look, that blood stain, if it's just like appeared on you, not from your actual bedikah, from your check, but just suddenly you look down and you see it in your clothes, well, does that mean it was your Niddah, the time of the month? Or does that mean that it's a case of ziva, meaning that it is an irregular discharge? Because it came without checking and without consideration, you're not 100% sure when it even happened. Rabbi Meir says, we have to consider that this may be ziva. However, if a woman makes a mistake in her reckoning, there is no reopening of her, meaning of the Niddah count, earlier than 7, nor later than 17 days. But the sages say, in the case of bloodstain, there is no need to consider the possibility of there being due to ziva. So that's the actual Mishnah. Now, Dr. Culp goes on to explain that, yes, this is complicated. And with your permission, I will walk you through his commentary, because I think he hits the math more easily than I would do off the top of my head while talking. So what he's saying here is that there is a counting during the menstrual cycle, something we've touched on before, and that the counting is what helps us tell the difference between menstrual blood, which would cause the woman to be impure according to the Torah for 7 days from the first sighting, and then regardless of whether there are additional sightings during, as he says, even if she continues to bleed, and non-menstrual blood, which would cause a woman to be impure for 1 day, and just 1 day, unless she sees blood for 3 straight days, in which case she is impure for 7 full days following the final sighting of blood. So those are the 2 categories. Niddah is the first, which is the normal monthly cycle, and ziva is the latter, which is 1, but more commonly the 3 days, followed by 7 days that are no sightings added to, however. So 3 plus, so it could be 3, 4, 5, 10, whatever. And then when the blood is no longer flowing, you start counting 7 clean days. So in order to try and tell the difference between is this Niddah or is this ziva, the rabbis wanted to do some math. So they instituted an 18-day cycle to calculate when blood was menstrual and when it was non-menstrual, as we have talked about before, with the 7 plus 11 days following during the period essentially associated with ovulation. So when a woman first sees blood, she considers it to be menstrual blood, and she is impure for 7 days from the time she first saw the blood, as normal. After these 7 days, any blood seen over the next 11 days is considered to be ziva. Why? Well, it can't be menstrual because she just had her monthly period, and therefore anything that's after the 7 days must be an irregular discharge and not part of the monthly cycle. However, after those 11 days, so now we are 18 days after the first sighting, now she is potentially available for the cycle to begin again, which would be, yes, very early biologically and certainly abnormal for the average woman, but not impossible. And thus, a new sighting that conforms to all of the other details would be considered to be menstrual blood. So what happens? Well, in our Mishnah, we're dealing with a situation where she made a mistake when counting, right? She didn't know whether she was in the 7 days or in the 11 days, and she saw the blood. So she doesn't know whether the blood she saw should be considered menstrual, in which case she's just impure for the 7 days, or ziva, in which case she's impure for only 1 day, or for a full 7 days if she sees the ziva for 3 straight days. So what does our Mishnah tell us to do when we have a situation where she has lost count and is unsure when she saw the blood or where she was in the count when it happened? Our Mishnah teaches that the beginning of her days of menstrual blood cannot be less than 7 days, after she doesn't see any more blood. No more than 17 days, all counted from the time she first saw blood. How this works out is a bit complicated, but I shall try to explain it very briefly, says Dr. Cole. Let's say she saw blood for 1 day. If these were days of Niddah, she could begin to count her next days of Niddah after 17 days, which is the maximum amount. This would mirror the normal situation. However, if she sees blood for several straight days, it may be possible that she only has to wait 7 more days after not seeing blood to begin counting her menstrual days, because that was just Ziva rather than Niddah. Let's say she sees blood for 3 straight days. She can then begin counting her menstrual days after 7 days without seeing blood, which would be sooner than the cycle if it had actually been Niddah. Because it doesn't matter if the blood she saw was menstrual or not, 7 days are sufficient to begin counting again. I realize that this is very complicated. As he points out, there are entire books that are dealing with this these types of calculations. And as we go on, we will talk more about this. So we're going to go ahead and leave it there. Oh, look, they have additional commentary there. I think he brought. All right, I'm not quite sure what happened with our commentary here, but yes, we are still dealing with this idea of the count and the recount. We're going to leave it there for tonight. My brain is getting addled, and we are going to move in hopefully to the final preparations for Rosh Hashanah, which when I'm recording this is just in a day and a half. If you're watching this at another time, well, then I hope you've already had a wonderful, good new year. And if you're watching with me right now, then Shana Tova imminently. And may it be a good year for us, for the community, for the entire world. And let's hope that this is the year of redemption. Take care, everyone. And I'll see you next Wednesday as